Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. Over the years on this channel, I've looked at lots of different computing developments that could have very negative implications. In this video, I'm therefore going to reflect on the potential downside of computing progress. Since 1990, the number of internet users has increased from about 3 million to over 4 billion. And undoubtedly this mass population of the internet has given rise to many advantages. However, the mass infrastructure of the internet could also be used for mass surveillance to monitor human activities, and that's clearly a potential downside of computing progress. Now, one of the first people to talk about the use of a mass surveillance infrastructure was a philosopher called Jeremy Bentham, who in the late 18th century designed factories and prisons that he called panopticons. And these featured central watchtowers that allowed all workers or all inmates to be subject to constant surveillance, with the idea being that this constant surveillance would make people in the panopticon more passive and hence easier to control. In 1995, I published this book, Cyberbusiness, which was all about the new realm of cyberspace and how the infrastructure of the internet could potentially become a cyber panopticon, an apparatus for observing and monitoring people, and hence which would make people more passive. And back in 1995, not many people were interested in this. People didn't know about the internet, they hadn't thought about the implications. These days, of course, the idea of the mass surveillance of people via the internet is a very hot topic. However, what I find interesting is the implications of that seem to be a bit different to what we thought it would be back 20 years ago, because these days the mass population of the internet or mass use of the internet hasn't made people more passive, it's arguably made people more aggressive. People hide behind their online anonymity, people troll people and abuse people online in the ways that we never thought were going to happen. And I think therefore what we're going to see in the next sort of 5-10 years onwards is more and more demands for more control of the internet, more monitoring of the internet. And therefore the impact of the internet in terms of human behaviour is going to be, I think, if anything, a loss of freedom of speech. It's going to be censorship rather than making people more passive as we initially expected. As humanity has embraced computing technology, we've undoubtedly surrendered a great deal of power to large computing companies. And without doubt, companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Facebook, they are now more powerful, more stable in some ways than many governments, and certainly richer than many governments. And this is clearly a potential downside of computing progress. Now, this point made, I do wonder what the alternative would be, because to develop the kind of computing systems we now rely on, the internet and all the infrastructure around that, we have needed standards. And standards like Windows and Mac OS and Android from Google, etc., these have been critical in building up the infrastructure we now rely on, the computing platform of the planet, if you like. And if these standards hadn't come from large computing companies, where would they have come from? Yes, we've seen the development of things like Linux, and that's sort of developing standards one way, but I think standards have had to have come from large companies. The only alternative would be standards coming from government. I don't think we would like government sort of laying down the standards to be used around the world for using computing technology. So in some ways I think it's inevitable. We've seen the rise of the cyber monopoly, and in some ways that's a bad thing, but in some ways it's been an inevitability to build the infrastructure we now rely on. Another thing that's made me think about this recently is I've had a lot of problems with my hosting arrangements for my websites and my email and this sort of stuff, and I've had to change my hosting providers and my domain management, my email servers and things, and I have gone, and this will shock some of you, to Google, to their G Suite product, their paid product, and to Office 365, the paid Microsoft product, for a lot of my email systems, or all my email now, and a lot of my domain management. And that has made me nervous, yes, because I've been giving all my data, if you like. My data is held by Microsoft and Google, and I don't necessarily trust what they'll do with that data, but I do absolutely trust Microsoft and Google to continue to exist, to run reliable platforms. They've got the scale to do that. They've got the scale for good governance infrastructures, etc. And I found it interesting that when I've been forced to go help what's going on with my infrastructure, what do I do? I've turned to the large computing companies for that level of certainty, of continuity, of service. And therefore, I'm in two minds about how bad a thing it is that we've seen the rise of the cyber monopoly. Since the Industrial Revolution, human workers have increasingly been replaced by technology. Most recently, in the 1980s, we saw the mass automation of many jobs with information technology. And in the next 2 decades, there is the potential for AI and robots and autonomous vehicles to automate a great many more human occupations. In the years ahead, the biggest downside of computing progress may therefore be mass unemployment. One of the things that most worries me personally about continued computing progress is its impact on our relationship with the physical world. Today, in a developed nation, a young person is now far more likely to be found inside using a computer or a smartphone or a tablet than they are to be found outside interacting with the physical world. It's also very common indeed for people to ignore people who are physically present, who are standing right next to them, in favour of interacting with people who are digitally present, who they interact with over the internet or a smartphone or something like that. It really does seem that in the past few years we have shifted our collective focus from the physical world to the digital world, from physical reality to virtual reality. And I do really worry that is a very negative thing. I forget who it is who said that as we wander through virtual forests, real forests will burn. But certainly that sentiment, I think, is a really important one to keep in mind. We are physical beings. We depend on the physical world, the physical atmosphere and environment of the planet. And if we don't actually look after that, if we don't spend some of our time in the physical world, it doesn't matter how good we are in the digital world, that everything will start falling apart. Now, having said that, it's also the case that the digital world has allowed us to interact and to empathise and communicate as never before. And that's a very powerful thing. And when thinking about that, I always come back to this book, a book published in 1994 by the late great techno-philosopher Timothy Leary. There he is on the front of the book. And as he said in this book, intimacy at the digital level programs and enriches exchanges in the warm levels. Interactions with your touch friends will be more elegant and pleasant with a digital reality option added. Another potential downside of our mass adoption of computing technology is the increasing range of risks it exposes us to. Today, the failure of a computer system can be catastrophic on a great many levels, and as more and more of our media and possessions and memories are stored only online in a digital format, so the greater the danger of placing all of our eggs in one big digital basket. Now admittedly, having said this, the internet was designed, it was intended to be a fault-tolerant network, and large computing organisations like those I mentioned earlier do invest a lot of resource in keeping our data safe. But even so, if we had, for example, a massive cyber-terrorism attack, or we had a big EM pulse from, say, a solar flare or a nuclear explosion, it could wipe out a great deal of digital information. In this context, it's worth remembering that the thoughts and creative actions of some past civilizations, such as the ancient Egyptians, have been retained in stone and metal for thousands of years. And it's interesting to speculate how today's digital media will survive in comparison to the treasures of antiquity. This said, the explosion of creativity and communication facilitated by digital technology may be worth the risk. We are, after all, right now looking at a digital Tutankhamun mask. So, perhaps we are right to have migrated so much to cyberspace and to live on the digital edge. The downsides to computing progress that I've mentioned so far in this video are all very real today. But in addition, there's also a whole host of other issues that could surround future computing progress. Not least, there could be serious problems associated, for example, with the creation of autonomous robots in the military, or indeed other robots or other androids which could get out of control. As I discussed on this channel a few months ago, some future computing technologies are also likely to be organic. When artificial computers are based on living wetware, we will therefore have some big ethical decisions to make concerning what is right and what is wrong when it comes to computing progress. Today, there are few who raise objections when anybody programs and reprograms a single-board computer like a Raspberry Pi. But will this remain the case when we start to reprogram real Raspberries? Like every other living thing, these fruit were a form of digital technology, with their amazing structures stored in an organic DNA code that manifests itself in reality via amazing digital fabrication processes. Already today, we've developed genetic engineering techniques that allow us to manipulate the natural world. But within the lifetime of most people watching this video, quantum computers and other artificial intelligence platforms will learn how to digitally manipulate not just raspberries, but the human body and large swathes of the natural world. This will offer amazing possibilities to feed everybody on the planet, to manufacture new products, to restore the environment and improve healthcare. However, as life itself becomes this century's dominant digital technology, the potential downsides may be very great indeed. 20 years ago, I used to upgrade my computer very regularly. Roughly every 18 months I used to rip out the processor, the motherboard, the memory, the graphics card, all that stuff, replace them with something else, and the result was always very positive. Things were always better, things were always faster. These days, however, I upgrade a lot less regularly because I've learnt that today when you do a computing upgrade, you have to lose to win. There's always things which are better because of the upgrade, that's why you did it, but there's also always things which are worse after an upgrade. And I think this lose to win thing is now evident not just in individual computer upgrades, but with a whole adoption of computing as a species, as the human race. And some things are great because we now use computers more and more and more, but as I've identified hopefully in this video, some things are also worse and potentially likely to go on getting worse the more we adopt computing. So I'd be very interested in your view on this topic. Do you view computing in its almost relentless sort of evolution and adoption as a good thing? Or should we sort of be cautious? Should we be stepping back a bit and recognising it isn't always positive to engage in computing progress? Anyway, do let us all know your view down in the comment section. But now that's it for this video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.